church picked up both the narratives of Matthew and Luke in many different ways. They were interested in every detail of the story, and they elaborated pretty much on every detail of the story theologically and also in narrative form in some of the apocryphal works. So if you start with the politics, if you like, the idea of the amount of danger that Jesus is in, that comes out already in the book of Revelation, where you have the woman and her son, the woman who's ready to give birth to the son, and the dragon is ready to eat the son as soon as it's born, but the woman is snatched up to heaven. And you have in Ignatius, the epistle of Ignatius to the Ephesians, which is often dated to, well, certainly the reign of Trajan, so the beginning of the 2nd century. You have this reference to the powers of this earth trying to kill Jesus at various different points, and his powers being hidden and then being revealed. That gets you to the whole theme of the Epiphany, which is one of the key ways in which the early church saw Jesus and saw the Nativity, and also the baptism, which is sort of the beginning of his public ministry. You get the baptism connected with the birth and with the Magi, the magicians from the East who come to see Jesus. So you, on the one hand, have that political side to it, and that's certainly clear very early on, and it resonates really after the fall of Jerusalem and then also after the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s. But in the 2nd century, the Nativity starts to become the time when you stress the humanity of Christ. And that's what you get in Irenaeus, for example, in the late 2nd century. You've already had a remarkable narrative in the mid-2nd century, what's called now the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is a kind of midrash, a discussion of, an elaboration of the themes of the Nativity in Luke mainly, but also Matthew. And they're drawn out and more stories are written about them. There's some really charming stories which actually are still with us in so much, particularly of Eastern iconography, but also some Western stories. So the idea that Jesus was born in the cave, the idea that Mary gave birth to Jesus in a cave, comes from that mid-2nd century text, the Proto-Evangelium of James. And also the midwives, which is something we don't necessarily think about today in a society in which birth tends to be often thought of as something that's medicalized and done by male doctors, done with the help of male doctors. In most societies, it's been done by women. And so you have two midwives in the Proto-Evangelium of James, and they're there because of the virginity of Mary, as witnesses to the virginity of Mary, and I'll come back to that in a minute, the importance of that. But they're also there just because you know there would have been a woman there, a midwife, to help Mary give birth to the baby, just as Mary herself had been midwife to Elizabeth. So you have this domesticity side of it. You have the idea of Jesus being born among the women and in the women's quarters, and the lowliness of that, and if you like, the slightly dubious character of that, which is very much dwelt on and celebrated by some early Christian texts, including by Irenaeus, who thinks that, in his theology of recapitulation, that Jesus in his life summed up the whole of the life that we lived, that he was a baby, he was a young man, he was a teenager. And that notion of the normality of Jesus, the fact that he was a real human, is something that Irenaeus uses to refute the Gnostics who want to suggest that he was a shadow or that he was an appearance of a human being and never really was human. It's an anti-Docetist, as scholars would say, argument that's very strong in Irenaeus, but it's also very strong in the culture. You suspect that the Proto-Evangelium of James was consumed particularly by women, might even have been written by a woman, and there's certainly this great celebration of the normality of the life of Jesus as a little child, and indeed the life of Mary as a little child, because that also appears in the Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, as you go on, so on the one hand you have the interest in the normal lowliness, if you like, the Lucan narrative. You also always have the interest in the political mess that you get out of the Matthean narrative, the danger, the sense of threat. But you also have the Magi, who are very important figures in the early church. In Ignatius, they represent the breaking of the power of astrology, the breaking of the power of magic. And what the Magi are there to do is to, if you like, throw down their wands, give up their jobs, and recognize that Jesus is the true power. And it goes along, in fact, with the doctrine of free will, goes along with the doctrine of our not being captured, if you like, in the power of the stars, the sort of Babylonian doctrines, and unable to do anything about it, but that Christ has broken all that and freed people so they can actually live moral lives in which they have real choices. So you have that already in Ignatius, and it comes back in Irenaeus as well. Later on, the Magi become, so in 4th, 5th century, the Magi become the great representatives of the non-Roman world. And initially that means the Easterners, it means the Persian Empire, and you get them dressed in Persian trousers. Then later on they become representative of Europe, Asia and Africa, and as they still are in many nativity sets, they are coloured, one as an African, one as an Easterner, and one as a European. Now meanwhile, the shepherds, initially of course they're there as outsiders. By the time you get to Augustine, they're representing the clergy who are the shepherds, who come and recognise that the Nativity is the source of all that they are trying to do, the source of their spirituality, the source of their attempt to help and shepherd the people. And then later on in the Middle Ages, as you can see in many pictures, there's a delight again in the sort of rough, tough nature of the shepherds, and you get plenty of paintings of them in which they're playing rustic instruments, bagpipes and so on, and in which they're very much warts and all, sort of lower class people, but coming to recognise the beauty of the child and coming to pay homage. So you have that side of it. And then from the 4th and especially the 5th century onwards, the Nativity also becomes the moment at which you recognise the divinity of Christ. So the doctrine of Mary as Theotokos, as the bearer of God, the mother of God, becomes crucial in the 5th century, as a recognition that Jesus is not just an inspired human being, but truly is God and inseparable from the Word of God. So that doctrine of Mary as Mother of God is really, some people worry about it saying something about too much Marian devotion, but it's really about the true divinity of Jesus. It's really about the fact that the incarnation means that God did truly become a human being.